Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Vineyard Design. This is for Vidi 300, Introduction to Viticulture and Enology, of course with Professor Claire Kessler, that's me. This is going to be in Chapter 5 of the Grape Grower's Handbook, specifically Section 5.2, which is Designing the Vineyard. So today we're talking about how to design a vineyard. We also have a really nice resource from Cornell Cooperative Extension here. It's linked in the presentation as well. Awesome. Okay, so just an overview. Once a site is selected, it comes time to design what the vineyard is actually going to be, right? The biggest things to keep in mind that you need is that you need to be efficient and very careful when you plan what the vineyard's going to be. This is going to impact how you spend your days working in the vineyard moving forward. So any little thing that bothers you or something that you just didn't look over will literally impact your work every day, right? So things that impact the design of a site include the site capacity, the grape variety that you want to plant, the rootstock characteristics, and your management practices as well, just to begin. But we have more than that as well. So first thing to think about is like the border of your vineyard, right? You have to have a lot of space to allow tractors and equipment to turn around in, to get from row to row, and also to kind of section off between your blocks as well, right? So the space at the end of your rows needs sufficient spacing. So you have your tractors, but also end posts. A minimum headland of 30 feet is recommended. If you're using like machine harvesters or very large equipment, it could be more than that, but it's something to think about, right? And then alleyways are just breaks between vineyard blocks, right? So something that you can drive vehicles easily through and big equipment that can turn around again. We do have an interactive vineyard map here from Benza Vineyards, and that's just if you'd like to see kind of how they've spaced out all their blocks and design. Next is partitioning the vineyard into blocks. So once you developed kind of that border and you have those headlands and alleyways mapped out, then you have the internal space you can work with, and then you can split the vineyard into blocks. Sites that are larger than several acres are often partitioned into multiple blocks, right? It could represent a single variety, a soil type, or even a topographic feature like a grade, existing fence lines, roads, or natural features like streams and rock outcroppings, right? So as you can see from this picture, we have different parts of these blocks, and they're all kind of oriented in interesting ways, right? So you can see the 6-acre parcel. This looks like it's mostly on a flat surface, and these are just straight, long rows that go throughout, right? And then you see this 4-acre parcel here. This looks like it's on a slope because the way that these lines bend upwards, right? So they've planted them in a different direction. It looks like the vines are going down the slope potentially and into the 6-acre and 8-acre cab lot. They have another level here, and so forth, right? So just depending on your topography, your hills, or if you have a flat surface, and also your surrounding trees, streams, and anything else you're trying to protect, all impacts the shape of your blocks, right? Cool. It's also very convenient to help with your record keeping as well. So you could say like, oh, well, maybe, this section of the vineyard has a different soil type than this section here, right? And then that way you can see, okay, well, maybe my management practices for this block will be different from this block because of that, right? Or maybe because this is on a hillside, we'll plant a different variety, and then we can track that separately from everything else too, right? So labor costs, pesticide costs, fruit yields, much, much more can all be tracked when everything's partitioned into blocks. It's a lot easier to keep it organized. Cool. So you have your blocks. Then it comes time to set a baseline, right? So you would ideally need straight rows. So that way you can pace everything out in a way that it's consistent. You have consistent spacing and everything, so you can fit machinery, tractors, etc. through, right? So establishing a baseline is extremely important. You can start by choosing a fence or a road to establish the first row. Growers use the right triangle rule, which is the 3-4-5 rule, to establish a perfect 90-degree baseline at the end of each row, right? So if one end of the triangle is 30 feet, the other one's 40 feet, the C or the this longer portion should be 50 feet, right? The hypotenuse. Yes, I believe that's the word. Haha, I haven't used that for a long time. So 3, 4, 5, right? So this is just an example. It's also a squared plus b squared equals c squared, right? Is the other theorem for that. So it's very important that you have a 90-degree angle to make sure that the rows are spaced properly. You can also use Surveyor's Transit, CNA, for exact angles to lay out the line rows, which would be very helpful, right? Cool. I've seen a lot of people use like tape and stakes and little flags to help get them started, and that can help to keep it straight as well. Okay, next, once you have partitioned everything out into blocks and you set your baseline, then you need to decide how you want your rows to be oriented, right? Are you going to do north-south, east-west? You know, are you going to do northeast, southwest, you know, etc., whatever orientation you want to do, that has to be a decision as well, right? So oftentimes what's chosen for wineries is what's most practical for management and for equipment and safety, right? So convenience and workflow. If the field is a long rectangle, often planting fewer long rows is easier than many short rows. It's less movement for tractors, right? The tractor is just going in a straight line for a longer period of time rather than turning around over and over again. This can be a lot more efficient on your time. The other thing to consider is the ripening patterns. North-south orientation is preferable so both sides of the vine receive similar amounts of sun, except in hot climates. This can create sunburn on the west side of the vine because that's when it gets most intense, right? Because the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. If you have a northeast to southwest slant, it can help minimize the late afternoon sun exposure while maximizing the morning sun. If you have east-west rows, you can have uneven ripening in regions with cool climates, and it can cause sunburn in the southern side of the vine in hot climates. So it really just depends. And then we have a little asterisk here because this only really applies to the northern hemisphere. If you're working in the southern hemisphere, your perspective on your vineyard orientation is going to be different, right? And then we have 2 videos here on row orientation that are really helpful to just reinforce the concept. So if you have time, please take a look and watch those. There are real winemakers and viticulturists from real wineries talking about why they made the decisions that they did. So it's very helpful. And then a couple more things to consider for your orientation of your rows is wind damage. If you live in an area with extreme winds, it could be very harmful to your vines, right? So depending on your situation, you may need to consider a parallel or perpendicular planting or establishing wind breaks, right? So you could plant those very tall cypress trees, or you could establish like this windbreak netting. There's lots of options of what you could do to protect your vines from wind, but something to consider. Something else that's very important is you want to avoid erosion of your soil. So if you're planting vines on a slope, you want to make sure that you're planting them perpendicular to the slope to prevent erosion of the soil, right? So you want them to go across like the belly of the hill and not up and down the hill necessarily, right? That would be most ideal. Okay, once you've determined your orientation of your vines, then you need to figure out how big are your rows going to be? What is your row spacing, right? So it really depends on what style of training and trellising system that you want. Generally speaking, 8 to 10 feet is the most common row spacing for conventional vineyards. Most vineyards use VSP, which is vertical shoot positioning. So it's like one axis that the vine is growing on, kind of like this double cordon you see here, and then the shoots will just go straight up. There are other types of training systems that are wider that require more space. So that'd be like the Geneva double curtain, right? Where it comes off the base, splits into a T, and then it looks kind of like an H letter at the very top, right? So it splits open and then it continues to grow, and so forth. So there's a couple of training systems like that. Also the Lyre system. And so because they require more space, you'll need to factor that in with your row size too, right? Because you still need enough space for your tractor and equipment to get through. So for those, you're looking more at 10 to 12 feet per row for spacing, right? Also, wider row spacing is just recommended for steep terrains. If you have a 5 to 15% slope, you should try to consider more space for moving around. Awesome. Another thing to consider when you space your vines is your first inkling might be to put as many vines as you can into one spot to maximize your production and grow as much fruit as possible. Well, that's good in theory. However, the most ideal planting situation is a 1-to-1 ratio of the height of your vines to the width of your rows, because that is what maximizes the sun interception as the sun goes throughout the day, right? So as you can see in these photos, this grapevine is 6 feet tall, 6 feet 0 inches, and a 4 to 6 foot spacing only will give you about 4 hours and 45 minutes of sun time, right? A 6 foot spacing will give you 7 hours, and then a 9 foot spacing will give you 8 hours and 12 minutes of sun exposure, right? So very important to consider, right? Because as the sun rises, say this is the east, right? It's hitting the right side of this vine. And as it comes over into the afternoon, it hits this back side or the left side, right? So it's very important to consider that your spacing is ideal, so that way the vines can each get the light that they require to produce high quality fruit, right? So 1-to-1 ratio is most ideal, right? Okay. Next, we have vine spacing. So we talked about the row spacing. Now we're talking about the spaces between the individual vines, right? So the spacing between the vines depends on the vigor of the variety that you're planting, the fertility of the soil, the type of trellising system that you're working with, your climate conditions, and farming equipment dimensions, right? So the more vigorous your vine is, the more space you'll need. So vines can produce more, so let them, basically, right? Give them the space to grow. Cooler sites normally have less vigor than warmer sites, so they can be planted closer together. Ultimately, your goal is vines should fill the entire trellis after pruning with well-spaced, fruitful buds. If it's too crowded, like the neighboring vines are kind of crossing over into each other's territory, it can have excessive shading and will impact the quality of your fruit, right? So generally speaking, 6 to 10 feet between vines is generally recommended, right? So 6 to 7 feet specifically for Vitis vinifera. It's more of a lower vigor grape species. 8 to 10 feet for American and French American hybrids because they are more vigorous, right? Perfect. Next, we have vine density, right? So vine density is a combination of how closely you plant your vines together and how close your rows are together, right? So a lot of this is that comes into play is the width of the rows that makes the biggest impact on this number. In Europe, you'll see easily 4,000 to 5,000 vines per acre, which is crazy. In California and Australia, generally we have 1,100 to 1,600 vines per acre, and that is because we have a lower cost of land relative to labor. We also have benefits of lower harvesting costs in general, and we also tend to implement wide tractors in our vineyard rows, right? So we have a lot of machine harvesting in California and Australia, and so it is just different here. We also have some of the most fertile soils in California, so you'll see that we can space our vines out because they can produce more, right? So the less dense your plot of land is, the more vigorous those vines are. The more dense it is, so you have to put more vines in because they can't produce as much. They're less vigorous, right? So that's kind of a good way to think about it, right? So the lowest density are American varieties, are the most vigorous. So American varieties could also be your soil type as well if you have very fertile soil and rootstocks. Medium density would be higher quality hybrids. And then high density is Vitis vinifera. And then the highest density are the premium reds, right? The ones that are producing like 2 tons per acre, right? So you have advantages and disadvantages of planting high density, right? So your advantages would be each vine produces less fruit, so you have a better chance for crop to reach full maturity, right? So you're not stressing out those vines so much. They're taking on a load that they can easily handle, right? As the density increases, yield per vine increases, but yield per vine decreases, but yield per acre increases, right? So this should be decreases. Ignore this. I'm going to update that. Also, the total root surface area per unit vineyard also increases, resulting in improved use of the available volume of soil, right? So you're being the most efficient you can. Disadvantages: more vines equals more labor. It doesn't matter if it's 1 acre and if it's 1 acre of land for, let's say 1,000 vines versus 5,000 vines, right? The more vines you have, the more work it's going to be. So it's going to cost you more for labor, materials, and overall costs. You can have crowded vines will also increase the likelihood of disease pressures, right? If it gets too crowded in there, you could have poor airflow. You could have heightened levels of vegetation. So it really just becomes an overgrown jungle, and then it becomes very difficult to manage if you didn't appropriately account for how vigorous the vines are, right? So be very careful about that. So some things to consider. And with that, we have our student learning objectives. So definitely a shorter presentation than normal, but that is what the textbook provided. Please do check out the Cornell extension link that I posted on the title slide. I think it's very special because it outlines the 3 years of preparation it takes to prepare a vineyard and the steps that need to be done. I think it's very helpful, especially if you're considering planting your own vineyard. So definitely check that out for more information. Also, if you guys have any questions, feel free to send me an email. And I hope you enjoyed. All right, thanks.